It was not the trip to Utah that anybody that follows the Memphis Grizzlies wanted to see from the Bears of Beale Street. 2 losses, Memphis licking their wounds, heading to the last game of their road trip against the Portland Trailblazers. What are some things that we learned, or perhaps what were some things that we were reminded of across these 2 losses, especially the one most recently on Halloween night? It was scary hours, but in the wrong way for the Memphis Grizzlies. We're going to talk about that and more on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen each and every day. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts. We are also on YouTube. Rate, review, subscribe, however you get your Memphis Grizzlies content via the interwebs, YouTube, podcast, whatever. Hopefully you make Locked On Grizzlies your very first attempt at trying to figure out this basketball team that is currently going through some stuff is a fair way, I think, to put it. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs help you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. I am Joe Mullinax, once again flying solo on this episode. I promise you, DeMichael Cole still works with Locked On Grizzlies. It's just a late night. He's covering for the Commercial Appeal. DeMichael and I will be back together recording for the Wednesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. So make sure you're not missing that episode. Hopefully you're going to stick through this one. I promise the takes will be mild. The jokes will be mild as well. Just hang out, right? For the next 30 minutes or so, give me a chance to help you kind of guide yourself through the cataclysm that is the Memphis Grizzlies at the moment. And of course, I'm showing off my best Grizz Twitter impression in terms of my overreaction to what is happening with the Grizzlies in this moment. They go to Utah, right? The Memphis Grizzlies go to Utah, and you expect them to get at least one of those games. They don't. The Grizzlies do not. They had a better chance on Saturday night, it turns out, to get a win. Their game on Halloween was even uglier than the game on Saturday night. The Jazz win 2 of the 4 frames. The second quarter was once again a massive problem for the Grizzlies. They're outscored by 20 this time as opposed to 14, and Memphis is never really able to get their footing in a 121-105 loss to the Utah Jazz. So the Utah Jazz currently undefeated at home. The Utah Jazz currently 6-2. I doubt that will stay the same in terms of win percentage the remainder of the season. And we'll talk more about that idea of remembering there's a remainder of the season as we go through this episode. But these 2 games against Utah and Monday night's game in particular serve as an opportunity to remind us of some things. And I think the first thing that this game reminds us of, and this series reminds us of, is just how good Joe Morant is. Right? And that feels like a cop-out. Come on, Joe. I already know that Joe Morant is really good at basketball. In 31 minutes of play on Monday night against the Utah Jazz, again, in a 16-point losing effort, here's what Joe Morant did. 12 for 18 from the field. Only took 2 threes. Made one of them. But that means he was 11 for 17 from the field in total. He attempts 15 free throws, making 12 of them, 5 rebounds, 4 assists. It's 37 points in 31 minutes of action. Luka Doncic deserves all the publicity he gets. Giannis Antetokounmpo, obviously the best basketball player on the planet. Those 2 guys are going to be in the MVP conversation. Ja Morant is also in the conversation. If you want to put him third, I get it. You're not going to get an argument from me, but he's in that chat. He has entered the chat when it comes to legitimate MVP contender. He is that good at basketball. And he was able to do that against the Utah Jazz without his second and third best players on the floor. No Desmond Bane on Monday night due to an ankle injury. Jaren Jackson Jr. continues to remain out because of his foot problems. So the starters alongside John Morant were Dillon Brooks, which, Dillon will be there when the team is healthy, more than likely. Steven Adams, which, again, likely to be there when the team is healthy. John Konchar, maybe the 9th best player on the team. And Santi Aldama, the 10th best player on the team. Those two guys started and played. Aldama played 24 minutes. Konchar played 26 minutes. That's not a reality for a good basketball team. It's just not. John Konchar is not a starter that plays 26 minutes on a good basketball team. Sorry to the Jitty Army, everybody that is up in arms listening to this right now, being so frustrated that how dare I go against their beloved Jitty. John Konchar has proven his NBA value. It is not as a starter. It just isn't. And that's okay. It's not meant to be a knock. It's meant to be continued acknowledgement of what I talked about on our last episode of Locked On Grizzlies. These guys are playing over their heads. They are not in a position to be able to make up for the mistakes that they are currently making, especially on the defensive end. They don't have the talent currently because so many pieces of talent are injured. They are out or they're ill. They aren't able to be active in the game. That is why you see shooting concerns, because you don't have Desmond Bane. You don't have Jake LaRavia, Zaire Williams. These are all guys that would be threats from beyond the arc. Jaren Jackson Jr. in and of himself. They're not there. They don't have the talent currently that is healthy to be in a position to compete except for John Morant. John Morant's the only guy that's currently in the role he's supposed to be in. And you can argue Steven Adams as well. Dillon Brooks is not supposed to be the second scorer. It's just not supposed to happen. And we were reminded of that in the Monday night loss. 6 for 16 from the field. Shot relatively well, 3 for 7 from beyond the arc. 19 points on 16 attempts. Dillon's had worse nights. But he's not supposed to be a second option. That's not ideal for this Grizzlies team. Santi Aldama, sure as heck, is not supposed to be your fourth option, and that third option, and that shined through number one with a bullet in this one. Same thing with John Konchar. The two combined to shoot 3 of 15 from beyond the arc, 3 of 15 overall from the field, 0 for 5 from beyond the arc. And there were some good things. Aldama grabbed 8 rebounds, 3 steals for Konchar. It wasn't all negativity there. And Aldama actually in 24 minutes of play was a +3. So the Grizzlies outscored the Jazz by 3 points while Aldama was on the floor. But again, single game plus minus is a flawed stat. Your eyes tell you that Santi did not have the best game, and the numbers back that up, especially on the offensive end of things. So we have confirmation that John Morant is indeed that dude. We have confirmation that there are multiple players playing over their heads at the moment. One last example of that, David Roddy. David Roddy, who shot relatively well on Saturday night, 4 for 5, I believe, from the field, 2 for 3 from beyond the arc, did not make a single shot in 29 minutes of play. He was the only Memphis Grizzlies player to finish with a plus-minus of -20 or more or worse. So he had the worst plus-minus in this game. And again, individual game plus-minus, to rely too heavily on that is a fool's errand. I wouldn't recommend it. And Roddy grabbed 6 rebounds. He snagged 2 assists, 1 block, so 3 stocks. He was one of the best in the game of this game for the Grizzlies in that endeavor. But 0 for 8 ain't going to cut it, especially when you're in a position where you need scoring because Zaire Williams is out. Jake LaRavia is out. Maybe we got further confirmation in this game that David Roddy, when the team is healthy, needs to be the guy who is off to the side. And that was probably going to happen anyway. Jake LaRavia has a better shooting stroke. He probably brings more offensive punch to a reserve unit that's desperately going to need it. But Roddy's probably that 11th man. Between him and Xavier Tillman, they're both in that mix. Is Roddy ready to even do that? I think that's a fair question. And that doesn't make it a bad draft pick. That doesn't mean that Roddy shouldn't be a Memphis Grizzly. I will remind you, dear listener and dear viewer, that Zaire Williams this time last year and into November was one of the absolute worst basketball players in the entire National Basketball Association. Fast forward a year, and we're talking about missing him as one of the top 8 players on the Memphis Grizzlies. A lot of basketball is yet to be played. Context is important. This team is far from healthy. But there are things to be concerned about. You can feel good about Joe Morant continuing to dominate offensively. You can feel good about a relatively efficient Dillon Brooks performance. But there's one area, regardless of health, that has been a constant concern for these Memphis Grizzlies throughout these last 7 games now that Memphis has played. And that concern continues in our next segment here on Locked On Grizzlies. But before I get to that, I want to make sure that I'm shouting out LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. I love my personal experience with LinkedIn. They do phenomenal work in terms of connecting, networking. LinkedIn Jobs is very much the same in terms of especially how easy it is to create a free jobs post there on LinkedIn Jobs. Then you add the job, the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile. You spread the word that you're hiring in that simple way. And there's other simple tools like screening questions that make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and to hire. It's important to finish this year strong, heading into November, the last 2 months of 2022. The right team member can help you do just that. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs help you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. The defense of the Memphis Grizzlies leaves something to be desired. Chances are, if you're listening to this, you've watched a Grizzlies game or two, and my tease from the previous segment doesn't really surprise you. You're like, Joe, this bores me. Tell me how you are in a position to pontificate on the conundrum that is the Memphis Grizzlies defense. Well, let me tell you, dear listener, dear viewer, I am more than capable of doing just that. I have watched a ton of Memphis Grizzlies basketball over the last decade. I have seen good Grizzlies basketball, and I have seen bad Grizzlies basketball. I have seen healthy Grizzlies basketball, and I have seen not so healthy Grizzlies basketball. I am more than qualified. It's bad Grizzlies basketball right now, and there's not much better that can be said about it. Context is important. When you're out a defensive player of the year candidate, that's obviously going to impact you. When you are missing a 6'9" wing who can defend lots of perimeter players, that is also going to negatively impact you. All of that context matters. However, there's no denying that for whatever reason, whether it's because Kyle Anderson and DeAnthony Melton are no longer in Memphis, whether it is because they have been replaced by rookies, there's a lot more ball watching going on at the moment for the Memphis Grizzlies. A lot less lateral movement, a lot less extra rotation, way too many open threes being taken. The game against the Jazz on Halloween night is a great example of that. Utah shot 19 of 47 from beyond the arc, 19 made threes, 40.4% conversion rate. That's very good. And again, at that high rate of attempts, that makes it even more important. The Grizzlies only shot 26 threes, making just 6 of them. So 23%. The Jazz ran a lap a couple of times around the Grizzlies. Utah made 19 threes. The Grizzlies only made 6. And a lot of those shots were wide open catch and shoot threes. It's not like all of them were the Colin Sexton step back 3 variety, which he hit one time over Ja Morant, and Ja just kind of looked at him and shrugged. And I'm with you, Ja. I hear you on that. Sometimes you tip your cap, somebody makes a hell of a shot. That was not the case throughout the night. Whether it was Lauri Markkanen, 4 for 6 from 3, Mike Conley, 5 for 7 from 3. We mentioned Sexton, 2 for 4, Malik Beasley, 4 for 9. These guys were way too comfortable beyond the arc because they weren't forced off their spots consistently enough. They didn't have to put a dribble on the ground and have to find a different angle in line of sight to the rim to get their shot off. Memphis allowed for the Utah Jazz to get to their spots and get into rhythms. And when you do that for any NBA team, regardless of amount of talent that they have, they are going to be able to compete. They are going to find themselves in positions to make wide open buckets. They are professional basketball players. It's not like they are complete and total jokes. That's not the Utah Jazz. Sure, they are likely tanking. I would be stunned to see them stay where they currently are near the top of the Western Conference. I don't think anybody expects that to continue beyond this coming month. Again, there's a reason why I say call me at Christmas. By the time you get to December 25th, you have a decent idea, maybe not of who the top seeds will be in each conference, but you have a decent idea of who's legitimately trying to make the playoffs and who is not a playoff team. That is fairly clear. The Jazz will likely be closer to the bottom of the standings as opposed to the top. They're just starting really well, and they deserve credit for that. The Grizzlies have not played as well as they could have, especially in Utah. Major reason for that, the health concerns that we've discussed. But even when the team was healthier, even when the team had Desmond Bane out there before he got banged up, even when Jake LaRavia was in the mix, the Grizzlies ball watched. The Grizzlies didn't rotate cleanly enough. The Grizzlies gassed and gambled. They attacked passing lanes and prioritized trying to create transition opportunities as opposed to keeping shooters and dribble penetrators in front of them. And that's not Grizzlies basketball. It's not. The Grizzlies are not being nearly opportunistic enough. They are forcing the rhythm on defense. They are not letting the game come to them. And that is where you miss primarily the veteran presence of a Kyle Anderson. That is where you miss primarily the defensive energy and length of a DeAnthony Melton. That's not to say that the Grizzlies are losing to the Jazz because they don't have Kyle Anderson and DeAnthony Melton. I'm saying that those players, as I've said all along since I've joined Locked On, those players mattered. And when you replace veteran presences with rookies, there is going to be a bit of a step back. Doesn't mean there's not going to be a long-term come up. Doesn't mean that David Roddy and Jake LaRavia, especially LaRavia, don't have higher ceilings than Melton and Anderson at a lower price tag, especially when you consider that. That's all true, potentially. But it doesn't help you in the short term. It doesn't help you in the here and now. As I mentioned earlier, Zaire Williams was one of the worst NBA players in the entire league this time last year. Why are we surprised that David Roddy is struggling? We shouldn't be. Why would you be shocked that Jake LaRavia having a health concern when he's one of the few knockdown shooters on the team, non-COVID illness keeping him out for the second straight game? You're surprised that negatively impacted the offense of the bench? They need spacing. Look at some of the rotations that were trotted out there. Xavier Tillman alongside Brandon Clark, Xavier Tillman alongside David Roddy. There are times where there's only one or maybe two at most floor spacers that legitimately have to be respected by their opponent, in this particular instance, the Utah Jazz. But none of that is possible without strong defense. Taylor Jenkins will be one of the first ones to do that. He talked about that in his post-game media availability, the importance of how defense transitions to offensive energy. Even if it doesn't directly lead to offensive opportunity, it will lead to offensive energy. Defense feeds offense. If you don't have strong defensive play, especially for a team that is down multiple talented players like the Grizzlies at this moment, you are not going to get offensive opportunity. If this continues defensively, the ball watching, the guessing, the missing of rotations because of inexperience, you will not see dramatic improvement as the team gets healthier. Jaren Jackson Jr. can't cover for everybody. He is not that level of a talent. Very few guys are. He will help some when he comes back, hopefully in the next 2 to 3 weeks. But until that time, they have to recommit to where their positions are on the floor, the effort that it takes, the ability to slide your feet, to not guess, to trust your reads. And if you don't know what your read is, to try to learn and grow and develop that ability to see what the offense is trying to do to you. The Grizzlies got younger in the offseason. I think part of their current concerns and issues are related to that on the defensive end. When we come back, we will finish out this episode of Locked On Grizzlies talking about some surprises. We've talked about things that were confirmed, things that we already knew, some things that surprised in the Grizzlies' loss on Halloween to the Utah Jazz. There was one thing that really stood out for me in that way that I look forward to discussing with you. But first, thanks for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen. For your next listen, check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and of course, the take of the day. It's available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. When we come back, we're closing out with surprises from the Jazz Grizzlies game on Monday night. You're listening to Locked On Grizzlies. Don't go anywhere. Surprises here on Locked On Grizzlies, things that really kind of took us aback or took me aback. Joe Mullinax here with you. And one thing that really shocked me in terms of watching this game, it was perhaps the worst I have ever seen Tyus Jones play in terms of protecting the basketball. Tyus Jones in 27 minutes of play had 5 turnovers and only 2 assists. I can't recall the last time that's happened. Tyus is Mr. Assist to turnover ratio. Tyus is Mr. Protect the Rock. He is the guy that makes sure that extra possessions they stay extra because he doesn't lose the ball. But he lost the ball 5 times. Steven Adams, in just 19 minutes of play, lost the basketball 4 times. Between those two guys that are usually unlikely sources of turnovers, 9 possessions lost. You're not winning basketball games that way. You need Steven Adams to be that secondary facilitator on the elbow. You need Tyus Jones to be that secondary point guard. The best point guard in the NBA, creating shots for others while protecting the basketball and possessions for a Grizzlies offense that desperately needs every possession it can get with so much talent currently out. So those were surprises for me, how much Adams struggled maintaining possession of the ball, and especially how much Tyus Jones struggled. He shot relatively well, 12 points on 9 shots, 2 for 5 from beyond the arc, but those 5 turnovers, they stick out like a sore thumb because that is not Tyus Jones's game. He was forcing things. He felt the need to try to be more than he is capable of being on the offensive end. And that hurt the Grizzlies in this contest. There's no denying that, in my opinion. Another major surprise, the positive minutes for Xavier Tillman. He has been much maligned. We mentioned how he shouldn't probably play with anybody else that can't really space the floor, whether it's Brandon Clark, whether it's David Roddy. Roddy, in theory, can space the floor, but he hasn't done it consistently yet. Certainly shouldn't play with Steven Adams. And yet, Xavier Tillman, one of the bright spots, 5 rebounds in 17 minutes played, -2 in terms of that plus-minus mark. That, is imperfect in just single games. But you saw good minutes from X. His free throw shooting was atrocious, which really wasn't a surprise, unfortunately. The Grizzlies struggling as mightily as they did, 23 of 42 from beyond the arc. Memphis, if you're a Grizzlies fan, you can't come away from that game saying that the refs cheated you, because the officials were very much on the side of the Grizzlies when it came to free throw attempts. But Utah was 18 of 22, and the Grizzlies were 23 of 42. Utah shot 82% from the charity stripe, The Grizzlies shot roughly 55%. But that's not surprising. We've seen this team struggle with free throws. So as damning as that is not a surprise in terms of how this game played out. Another surprise for me, John Conchar not making a 3. Johnny Conchar must have listened to Locked On Grizzlies because he took more shots. In the previous day's episode, I talked about how it was necessary for Conchar to let it fly a little bit more than the 0 for 2 that he had against the Jazz in Saturday night's game. As a starter, in 26 minutes of play in this game against Utah, he took 4 threes, but was 0 for 4. So he didn't make a single shot, but at least he took them and he was in better positions to make them. He will get going. I'm not worried about him missing those shots. I'm glad to see those shots increase. I'm just surprised that he actually listened to me. Obviously, Johnny Conchar probably just saw the opportunity to hit some threes and took them. But the fact remains, he was improved, at least in terms of how he shot the basketball. I was surprised in how low the team's assist numbers were. 14 assists. That is extremely low. They had more turnovers, again, perhaps for the first time in a long time, more turnovers than assists, 16 turnovers to 14 assists. The Grizzlies aren't winning basketball games when that happens. And it goes back to Tyus Jones, Steven Adams not protecting those possessions. You expect to see John Morant have 3 turnovers. That doesn't surprise you. He has too high of a usage rate to not have some turnover of the basketball. But for them to not be able to finish shots, for them to not be able to make threes in particular, for them to have more lost possessions than made buckets off of passes, that's a sign right there that the Grizzlies' offense is struggling, not just their defense. Ball movement, getting the best shot, passing up a good shot for a great shot, those are all hallmarks of Grizzlies basketball, and you haven't seen it consistently because of their injuries, because of those concerns. And that is the last surprise that I will leave you with on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. It's a surprise, but it's not a surprise. I am surprised at the inability to hold on to context at times. This Grizzlies team is without, quite literally, 40% of their rotation if you subscribe to the Jake LaRavia as the 10th man philosophy. Tyus Jones, John Conchar, Zaire Williams, Brandon Clark, Santi Aldama. Maybe LaRavia is the 11th man when this team is healthy. But they didn't even have LaRavia. They certainly didn't have Desmond Bane, didn't have Jaren Jackson Jr. What do you expect from a team that is without 2 of its 3 best players? Surely you didn't think that they were going to look dominant. My hope was always for a split of these 2 games in Utah because Utah's a tough place to play. And then you take into account the concerns about health. John Morant didn't play in game 1. Desmond Bane didn't play in game 2. The Utah Jazz got the Memphis Grizzlies without one of the best backcourts in the entire NBA being on the floor together. That's extremely valuable. Look at who the Utah Jazz started in the backcourt. Mike Conley and Jordan Clarkson. You're telling me that a Bane-Morant pairing wouldn't have torched those 2? Of course they would have. Of course they would have. You're telling me that a healthy Jaren Jackson Jr. doesn't make a difference on Lauri Markkanen? Markkanen had a hell of a game, 11 for 15, 31 points on 15 shots. He ate the Grizzlies' lunch. That doesn't happen with Jaren Jackson Jr. on the floor. And you have to remember, through the Halloween game, both Steven Adams and Brandon Clark got injured. Adams with his jaw and Clark with his finger. So they were even thinner by the end of the contest than they were when it started. The Grizzlies started the season 9-10 last year. They are currently 4-3. Yes, this early schedule appeared to line up to be a little bit easier for Memphis, but they're 4-3. They're going into a game against Portland, one of the better teams. Another good start in the Western Conference goes to the Trailblazers, and then they welcome the Charlotte Hornets back at home to close out the work week. How the Grizzlies respond. Can they be 6-4 coming out of these 10? If it extends with Jaren's injury into 20 games, can they be 12-8? Can they tread water with Jaren Jackson Jr. in particular out? Can they get Desmond Bane healthy? These are the questions that matter because the Grizzlies are losing games while not being at full strength. You can be concerned, be worried about the defense. I'm worried too. They need to improve there. But we have a much larger sample size that suggests that those improvements are coming. They will be here. They will get better. They just need to get their best players on the floor. Because if you're playing David Roddy for 29 minutes on a Monday night and then 2 nights prior you're playing him for 27 minutes, chances are you're not beating very many good basketball teams. And I think sometimes it's that simple. You need your best players to play if you hope to win in the National Basketball Association. Thanks for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today. For your second listen today, check out Locked On Sports Today. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights that only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today, available on this app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. The next time you guys will see me, I will be joined by DeMichael Cole, my wonderful co-host, for our episode together this week. Our schedules are a little bit screwy this time around, but it's going to be great to have DeMichael back with me. I'm sure he'll have some thoughts on the things that happened with the Utah Jazz. Obviously, we will preview the last game of this road trip, the Grizzlies going into Portland to take on the Trailblazers. Hopefully, there's some good health news that we can discuss on our next episode as well. So DeMichael and I will be back with you on these podcast and YouTube waves. But until then, thank you for listening, subscribing, watching, however you take in Locked On Grizzlies. It is appreciated. I'm Joe Mullinax. Continue to lock in, Grizzlies fans. This is Locked On Grizzlies.